Hi folks, we're back and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. You know, it's not too difficult to do your own searches and your own studies to find out that big players, big organizations run the world. And these organizations are above your governments and they're within your governments because they do have their so-called scientists placed on board with them, especially now. It's a fairly recent phenomenon to have all these scientists placed on panels within governments who then advise presidents and prime ministers supposedly what to do. They all know it's an inside joke because they're there to make sure the agenda, there's only one agenda, is carried forward. And you can find the agenda, again, going all the way back to very old authors who talked about depopulation and getting rid of the unfit and all of that kind of stuff in a world to come. And Thomas Malthus, of course, was one of the main characters shoved forth into history to start off the conversations amongst the wealthy about this and about the coming problems of shortages and sustainability and all the rest of it. This is where all this comes from. And it's no coincidence that the big foundations today that have carried on through Rockefeller and other ones are promoting the exact same agendas. But they also give us cognitive dissonance, as they call it, because we are trained to believe that charitable foundations and people who want to help us are there to help us. And when you also read that the same people are involved in depopulation, we go into a sort of click mode. We can't compute the two. Is he here to help me or is he here to kill me? And literally we tend to go for the better judgment, the nicer judgment, I should say. It's actually the wrong judgment, but the nicer one, the one that doesn't upset us too much because we've been trained to be sort of egocentric and we don't like to look at the bad things. And then you get into eugenics and modern times and so on. And you're going to understand it's truly, truly with you in a big, big way. And the articles I'm going to read, I'm going to put up tonight on my site, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, put the links up for you to look up for yourself. Well worth keeping a hold of too. Download them because things disappear so rapidly now from the internet. And this says here, they mention the people who are involved in eugenics, the political left as well as a political right in modern times. It says, note the stunning statements below by people like Bertrand Russell and George Bernard Shaw, or those by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is simply abortion across the world. I noticed recently they've got an incredible budget now, and they're going across the world in a big time to sterilize and abort children because she's the one who called them weeds, you see. If they don't have a function in society, if they're from the lower strata, they're called weeds. For the women and feminists who didn't know who the great hero happened to be. Great lover of Hitler and Stalin too, by the way. But Malthus, again, Malthus is the guy who first came out with the writings on could the earth sustain a certain population. He was wrong on all accounts, of course. In fact, about 50 years after he finished his book, he predicted we'd be standing about 5 deep on top of each other, and that didn't happen either. But he also called for the elimination of the poor, and he was all in favor of advocating poor houses and sort of housing complexes in the most disgusting and disease-ridden areas where the people would die off much faster. So it's quite interesting to read the letters between himself and others, and then, of course, those who came after him in the same, I call them same societies because they all belong to the same societies. And by the way, these characters were all specially bred themselves. They were inbred, just like the Darwin family. This movement's been on the go for an awful, awful long time, right? Even all the way back to Plato. And before him, I'm sure. But it says here, Charles Darwin agrees with Francis Galton's eugenic ideas. Now, the Galton family eventually bred into the Darwin family as well. Up until then, the Darwins had only inbred with the Wedgwood family for generations. But he agrees with them. You'll see that in the first letter there. He agrees. This is the personal letters between the two of them with their eugenics ideas and so on, and depopulation. And then Charles Darwin, in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, in his second edition, says this. It says, with savages, the weakened body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. In other words, disease and the whole bit is good. Those who survive are the healthiest. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbeciles, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert the most utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It's hardly surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. He says, the aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy even at the urging of hard reason without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature. The surgeon may hurt himself while performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit with an overwhelming present evil. We must therefore bear the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. But there appears to be at least one check in steady action, namely that the weaker and inferior members of society do not marry so freely as is sound, and this check might be indefinitely increased by the weakened body or mind refraining from marriage. By the way, that was part of the plans they discussed a long time ago at the Department of Population, it's really Population Control at United Nations, when they talked about fast takedowns in some countries by introducing disease. Well, bingo, you have a specific type of AIDS in Africa, very fast takedown. In the West, they decided that disabling diseases that would make them ineligible for marriage would be used. That's your crippling diseases and chronic fatigue. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back and we're cutting through the matrix, just reading some quotes that the big boys put out in the past. Remember that Darwinism and the whole idea of natural selection and the betterment of the race, as I like to call it, is part of academia. It's all to do with evolution. You must believe in evolution if you go into the universities in this day and age. It's a must be. You've got to believe in it. And along with all of that comes all of this as well that I've just been reading here, because this is what's all based upon: survival of the proper kind of humanity and not the lesser kind, you see. And they want to get rid of the weak, disabled, and so on. And that's what the whole ecological movement is based upon. Sustainability, etc., is a cover for this particular program, which has been so well documented by themselves and is taught in academia, of course, and is kept out of the general mainstream, at least in its more hard and straightforward form. This is also what Charles Darwin says here: elimination of the poorly endowed in advanced society. Great lawgivers and founders of beneficent religions, great philosophers and discoverers in science aid the progress of mankind in a far higher degree by their works than by leaving a numerous progeny. In the case of corporeal structures, it is the selection of the slightly better endowed and the elimination of the slightly less well endowed individuals, and not the preservation of strongly marked and rare anomalies, that leads to the advancement of a species. So it will be with the intellectual facilities, since the somewhat abler men in each grade of society succeed rather better than the less able, and consequently increase in number, if not otherwise prevented. When in any nation the standard of intellect and the number of intellectual men have increased, we may expect from the law of the deviation from an average that prodigies of genius will, as shown by Mr. Galton, appear somewhat more frequently than before. You're going to understand too, this is where the whole idea came from for books, novels like The Handmaid's Tale and so on, when they talk about actually special breeding, selecting special women for breeding. And by the way, they'd already been doing it back in the 1700s. And Benjamin Franklin kind of touched on that in one of his letters, since he was a member of one of those clubs. But it's a very good site, Margaret Sanger. All her cases are written in it, all her quotes and so on. And this is one of her quotes from Sanger for the feminists out there. Every single case of inherited defect, every malformed child, every congenitally tainted human being brought into this world is of infinite importance to that poor individual, but is of scarcely less importance to the rest of us and to all our children who must pay in one way or another for these biological and racial mistakes. And Sanger also praised eugenics. His degeneration has already begun. Eugenicists demonstrate that 2/3 of our manhood of military age are physically too unfit to shoulder a rifle, that the feeble-minded, the syphilitic, the irresponsible, and the defective breed unhindered, and the vicious cycle of mental and physical defect, delinquency, and beggary is encouraged by the unseeing and unthinking sentimentality of our age to populate asylums, hospital, and prison. All these things that the eugenicist sees and points out with a courage entirely admirable. So she was completely all for it. She was also for sterilization of what she called the feeble-minded. And the U.S. tends to forget that the Rockefeller boys and Cold Spring Harbor went into sterilization right up into the 1970s in the United States by simple court orders. And many people are suing now because they were sterilized by these court orders and classified as retarded, defective, simply not good enough to have progeny. And they also talk about birth control eventually being made mandatory, etc. But of course for that, what they did was bring in people like Bernays, who thought of other ways to do it. If you can't get what you want with society, what you do is you change society, and then they'll accept what you want. You make them think it's all for themselves, and they went to work creating the pill, and then saying, go ahead and have fun. Exactly what Julian Huxley also talks about. He says they'll be able to basically have as much sex as they want as long as they don't actually breed. That was the only stipulation. And that's what you've got today, the outcome of a big war going on that most folk are utterly ignorant of. And a lot of them are quite enjoying it at the moment as well. But in the book, The Next Million Years, a descendant of Galton and the Darwins is Charles Galton Darwin. And he was a physicist. He worked on the Manhattan Project because all these families are into mass killing. And he was all for the atom bomb. He worked on the bomb project. And he wrote a book too in the 1950s called The Next Million Years. But in the book I noticed too, as I was perusing it again for the umpteenth time there, a little quote. And he said that eventually he was talking about aging, creating life extension for those who have the best brains, the better breeding. And so they'd be relatively old and obviously wouldn't get partners. So he mentioned the fact that they would bring it in a form of pedophilia, and they make pedophilia normal so that the wealthy rich could still breed and pass on their genes. Interesting, isn't it? That's all over the media today as they push what they call intergenerational sex. And it's all in a whole bunch of Hollywood movies too. That's where you get most of your indoctrination. He then goes on to talk about in his book, Charles Galton Darwin, about how they breed racehorses. And he talks about how they slaughter the ones that finish last, etc. Then advises them they should really do the same thing with, well, humans, you know. Back with more after this. But as I say, that's the key to it. We're simply going through an agenda, and most folk will never accept it. Those who are totally under the technique which Bernays talked about, if you can't change or get the people to accept what we want them to do head on, naturally we'd say, no, I'm not going along with that, no way. They simply do it in such a way that you don't even know you're under attack. You're going to change your opinions, change your behavior, and adapt into the culture that's evolving all around you, all by the same technique at the same time. So you think it's all quite normal. what they've called them in the past is revolutions, sexual revolutions, this revolution, that revolution. But in reality, it was all planned for you, and everyone had a good time doing it, so they thought. But that's the key to it. Sciences, and they talked about bringing the sciences big time, Bernays, on the general public, and academia is well on board with it, with the massive grants from not only foundations but from government itself to work on techniques to manipulate the minds of the general populace using all the techniques available, and there's so many techniques available today. But here's another part from Charles Galton's book, Charles Galton Darwin's book, I should say, the physicist, and he says on page 183, he says, "It is in the biological sciences that the most exciting possibilities suggest themselves, perhaps because biology has only recently shown rapid advances like those made earlier in the inorganic sciences. I will only speculate on a few amongst these possibilities which might have great effects on human life. I've already referred to the possibility of quite new sources of food, and I need not enlarge on that further. Another type of discovery may be connected with hormones. Now, I've talked ad nauseum about the effects of the bisphenols and the phthalates and so on that are in the food supply and baby food as well, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how it's sterilizing, especially the male. He says, so hormones, those internal chemical secretions which so largely regulate the operations of the human body, the artificial use of hormones has already been shown to have profound effects on the behavior of animals, and it seems quite possible that hormones or perhaps drugs might have similar effects on man. For example, there might be a drug which, without other harmful effects, removes the urgency of sexual desire. You know, there's young guys, and there's studies been done on it, they're losing their interest in sexual behavior before they're 25 now. And so is their sperm count is plummeting too. And says, and so reproduced in humanity the status of workers in a beehive. So he wants to reproduce the humanity the status of workers in a beehive. Or there might be another drug that produced a permanent state of contentment in the recipient. After all, alcohol does something like this already, although its other disadvantages, and is only temporary in its effect. A dictator would certainly welcome the compulsive administration of the contentment drug to his subjects. Look at all the children that are doped up. And we've all accepted this now as normal. With fake diagnoses that just are written into a book as though it's a fact. Like the laws of Moses. Another possible, although remoter discovery, suggests the more curious consequences. This is the control of the relative numbers of the two sexes. It's known that the sex of a child is carried by the sperm, not the ovum, and it is at least imaginable that some method could be found for sorting out those of the sperm cells which carry the male or the female character. It would thus become possible to regulate how many men or women there should be in a population. Well, that's China was into that. They wanted more males, and they used old-time techniques because that was part of the cultural tradition already in China. They simply promoted it because they wanted lots of male workers and soldiers. It says if such a practice could be developed, it's sure that for a time there would be a greater imbalance in populations. A nation with ambitions for conquest would produce a large number of men for its soldiers, but would pay for it by not having enough women to give birth to the soldiers for succeeding generations. On the other hand, just as a stock breeder keeps few bulls and many cows, another notion might decide that it needed few men in order to maintain its numbers. Would such a predominantly female population be able to stand up against the male one, or would a rape of the Sabine woman rectify the disproportions? So then he goes on and on and on. And he says, to produce effects of this kind, there must be a master, and the master must be above and not subject to the procedure he's enforcing on his subjects. The dictator could not afford himself to take the contentment drug, because if he did so, his capacity for rule would certainly degenerate. It always comes back to the same point, that to carry out any policy systematically in such a way as permanently to influence the human race, there would have to be a master breed of humanity, not itself exposed to the conditions it is inducing, meaning forcing, in the rest. Now, remember, this guy was related to the Huxleys. He was related to the Darwin family, the Galton family, all eugenicists, all through every generation of them eugenicists. And he was telling you they already existed because they were all offspring of special selection, where they chose certain partners, or they were chosen for them. As I say, with the Darwin's side of his family, for generations, they'd only intermarried with the Wedgwood family. And when Charles Darwin's wife died, he married his mother's sister. They were already a master breed, you see, as far as they're concerned. They're not the only ones. You'll find this in the same philanthropic leaders as today at the top members, if you wonder what's really running the world. And it says the master breed would have to be wild animals, you see, not subject to having their brains tampered with contentment drugs or anything else, or injected with poisons to kill off brain cells. And this is what I'm saying here, because they've done this to the humans. It says the master breed, being wild animals, would be subject to all the fashions, tastes and passions of humanity as we know it, and so would never have the constancy to establish for generation after generation a consistent policy which would materially alter the nature of mankind. In connection with the recent wonderful advances in medical science, this is the place to mention a matter that will soon be very, indeed, of immediate importance. Since in the normal condition of the world, there will be a margin of every population on the verge of starvation, it seems likely that there will have to be a revision of the doctrine of the sanctity of the individual human life. Exactly the same thing as the first CEO of UNESCO, the United Nations, wonderful organization, said, and that was this guy's cousin, by the way, Julian Huxley. There'd have to be a revision of the doctrine of the sanctity of the individual human life. And by the way, as I say, when you see corpses plasticized and hung up in bar rooms and art galleries, you're being taught to be dehumanized, that life is really truly worthless. It's just another animal, and so what if they hang it up there for everyone to have a peek at and a laugh at the same time? You're laughing at your own future there, folks, because that's where you'll end up too. So, he also goes into world government, Charles Galton Darwin, and how they'd have to do it through agreements, international agreements. And he belonged to United Nations organizations, lots of them. He belonged to the top think tanks who planned this kind of stuff. And remember too, he talks about the people as being children. You can't tell the children the truth. Are you getting what I'm saying? But it says too, consider next what are likely to be unusual relations between the provinces. He calls provinces or regions of the world that this has been broken into, especially in North America. It says in this case, North America might fall into 4 or 5 provinces, that's the regions, and Western Europe into 1 or 2. It is never to be expected that there will be any permanence about the numbers of them or about their boundaries. Consider next what are likely to be usual relations between the provinces. It's too much to expect that there can ever be a permanent world government benevolently treating all of them on a perfect equality. Such an institution could only work during the rare occasions of worldwide golden age. He's talking about massive food consumption and distribution and all the rest of it. So, as I say, that's what these characters are into. Your future was planned before you were born, and everything that you think is normal in culture actually were given to you by these kind of characters and think tanks, and then marketed into your brain through your televisions, movies, and so on. And novelists too. They hired lots of novelists to get the ideas across into your minds. He also goes through famines, using famines, which would be man-made famines. They bring on disasters and all these wonderful ways to depopulate the world. And then he goes on to, if you wonder where and the United Nations got the idea that China is the model type for the world to follow. He says on page 198, remember this was written in the 50s, it says, it would seem that in its constancy and character, both in its virtues and its defects, the Chinese civilization is to be accepted as the model type of a civilization to a greater degree than any of the other civilizations in the world. Because you see, they have their one child per family and they have mass abortions, and a government is an authoritarian government that doesn't stand any rebellion, nonsense, or anything else. And they accept their famines quite naturally and die off like dutiful little citizens when it happens. But he says here too on page 203, is it possible that there should arise a eugenic creed, which perhaps working through what I've called the method of unconscious selection, should concern itself with improvement of the inherent nature of man, instead of resting content with merely giving him good but impermanent acquired characters? Without such a creed, man's nature will only be changed through the blind operation of natural selection. With it, he might aspire to do something towards really changing his destiny. So again, he praises China as a type that we should all follow. And that's what the United Nations does push. Back with more after this. Hi folks, I'm back and we're cutting through the matrix, just finishing off here on a little ramble. And that wasn't really arranged that way. I didn't arrange it at all. I just decided to go into this tonight when I get on the air. But here's also a little part from H.G. Wells, that wonderful guy who belonged to the Fabian Society, which is still of paramount importance today. It was set up and founded by and funded by wealthy families, the Astor family being one of them. And they knew they could not fail, actually. And when you read that from Wells's writings, it says they knew they couldn't fail by using sciences, especially the sciences of the mind, upon the general public. And unfortunately, he's been pretty well correct. But he goes on to talk about the men of the new republic. He's not about a world republic, by the way, will rout out and illuminate urban rookeries and all places where the base can drift to multiply. They will contrive a land legislation that will keep the black or yellow or mean white squatter on the move, so that childbearing shall cease to be a hopeful speculation for the unemployed poor. This euthanasia of the weak and sensual as possible, on the principles that will probably animate the predominant classes of the new time. It will be permissible, and I have little or no doubt that in the future it will be planned and achieved. And it reminds me of the tent cities that they've got in the States now, and the folk are kept getting moved on. And of course, when you're starving to death, you're not too worried about, you're not really thinking about sex and so on so much. You're trying to simply to survive. But I'll put this link up tonight to this very good site with a lot of their quotes and parts from their books in it as well. But people should get The Next Million Years, the other one I was reading from, by Charles Galton Darwin. I mean, this guy literally was specially bred for his purpose in life, as were the rest of the Darwin family. And he doesn't pull punches at times. He'll say some incredible things that sound rather nice until you really realize, because the terminology he's using, until you realize what he's actually advocating is quite blunt at other times too. But if you wonder why the populations are plummeting in the West and the sperm count is going down to less than 25% of what it should be, even that is immotile. I mean, the sperm can't find the ovum. They've all been severely damaged. Then you understand it's not by... Nothing happens on a mass scale in society without something being made to make it happen. Nothing happens. You don't suddenly evolve into sterile creatures. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen at all. But they also talked about using hormonal treatments on women. They'd be unaware of it because, again, it would be in their foods as well and so on, and how it would affect them. And believe you me, they knew damn well that the cancer rates and so on would increase, because that's all part of the big plan. That's truly, folks, the world we live in. I don't want to give you nicey little shows here. I don't want to scare the living daylights out of you. I'm trying to get you informed, and so that you understand what's actually happening today. How much money has the Cancer Society brought in over the last, 80 odd years? And where's the advances in treating cancer? Tell me that. There haven't been any slash and burn. Slash and burn. Same things. And who started that? That was the Rockefeller Foundation, who gave you your present medical treatment, because they have no intention of giving a cure for the diseases they cause. From Hamish and myself from Ontario, Canada, it's good night. I mean, your God or your gods go with you. They all know it's an inside joke, because they're there to make sure the agenda, there's only one agenda, is carried forward. And you can find the agenda, again, going all the way back to very old authors who talked about depopulation and getting rid of the unfit and all of that kind of stuff in a world to come. And Thomas Malthus, of course, was one of the main characters shoved forth into history to start off the conversations amongst the wealthy about this and about the coming problems of shortages and sustainability and all the rest of it. This is where all this comes from. And hi folks, we're back and this is Cutting Through the Matrix. You know, it's not too difficult to do your own searches and your own studies to find out that big players, big organizations run the world. And these organizations are above your governments and they're within your governments because they do have their so-called scientists placed on board with them, especially now. It's a fairly recent phenomenon to have all these scientists placed on panels within governments who then advise presidents and prime ministers supposedly what to do. It's no coincidence that the big foundations today that have carried on through Rockefeller and other ones are promoting the exact same agendas. But they also give us cognitive dissonance, as they call it, because we are trained to believe that charitable foundations and people who want to help us are there to help us. And when you also read that the same people are involved in depopulation, we go into a sort of click mode. We can't compute the two. Is he here to help me or is he here to kill me? And literally we tend to go for the better judgment, the nicer judgment, I should say. It's actually the wrong judgment, but the nicer one, the one that doesn't. We're involved in eugenics, the political left as well as a political right in modern times. It says, note the stunning statements below by people like Bertrand Russell and George Bernard Shaw, or those by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is simply abortion across the world. I noticed recently they've got an incredible budget now, and they're going across the world in a big time to sterilize and abort children, because she's the one who called them weeds, you see. If they don't have a function in society, if they're from the lower strata, they're called weeds. For the women and feminists who didn't know who their great hero happened to be, great love set us too much because we've been trained to be sort of egocentric and we don't like to look at the bad things. And then you get into eugenics and modern times and so on. And you're going to understand it's truly, truly with you in a big, big way. And the articles I'm going to read, I'm going to put up tonight on my site, cuttingthroughthematrix.com, put the links up for you to look up for yourself. Well worth keeping a hold of too. Download them because things disappear so rapidly now from the internet. And this says here, they mention the people